He thought his money made him untouchable, until the judge said 2 words that changed everything. The courtroom was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters whispered to each other, tapping notes on their laptops. The air held that heavy silence unique to high-profile trials, the kind where everyone in the room knew they were about to witness something historic. And at the center of it all sat Richard Sterling, a man worth billions, a man who built his empire with sheer cunning and ruthlessness, a man who believed the rules applied to everyone but him. Sterling lounged back in his seat, completely unfazed. He was dressed in a tailored gray suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, because why bother? This wasn't a man who played by anyone's standards. His cufflinks alone probably cost more than the average juror's annual salary. His expression? Pure amusement. This was just another meeting to him, another boardroom where he could manipulate the players and walk away untouched. The murmurs in the courtroom died down as the bailiff stepped forward. All rise. The room moved as one. Reporters, attorneys, spectators, even the jury, all standing in respect for the judge about to enter. But not Richard Sterling. He stayed seated, arms crossed, smirking. A murmur spread through the courtroom like a ripple in still water. The reporters took note. The jury stole quick glances at him. The prosecuting attorney tightened his jaw, already sensing what kind of day this was going to be. And then Judge Mia Adams entered. She was a woman who commanded respect without needing to ask for it. Mid-50s, sharp eyes, a calm but unwavering presence. She had seen arrogance before, entitled executives, corrupt officials, wealthy men who believed power was a shield. She barely glanced at Sterling. She didn't flinch, didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the blatant display of arrogance. She simply took her seat, adjusted her robe, picked up the file in front of her. Court is now in session. Her voice was steady, controlled, but the energy in the room had already shifted, because everyone was wondering the same thing. What was Richard Sterling trying to prove? And more importantly, what was he going to do next? But whatever they expected, they weren't ready for what was coming. A thick silence clung to the air, stretching uncomfortably across the room. Everyone had seen it. Sterling's refusal to stand wasn't just arrogance. It was a statement. A low murmur rumbled through the crowd, the kind of hushed whispers that only happen when people are trying to make sense of something they know is wrong but can't quite believe they just witnessed. One of the reporters, a young woman with a notepad covered in shorthand scribbles, leaned toward her colleague. "Did he just?" she whispered. "Yeah." The court clerk barely flicked his eyes toward Sterling, his expression unreadable. The bailiff, standing firm near the judge's bench, shifted slightly, waiting for a cue from the judge. But Judge Adams, she didn't react, didn't pause, didn't look his way. She simply continued, moving through the formalities like nothing had happened. It was a move only a seasoned judge could pull off, not giving men like Richard Sterling the satisfaction of knowing they'd rattled you. But everyone else in the room, they weren't as composed. The jury exchanged quick glances. Some of them, mostly older members, pressed their lips into a thin line, their irritation visible. Others seemed uncertain, glancing at Sterling as if trying to gauge if this was a stunt or something deeper. The prosecutors at their table were tight-lipped, focused, but their lead attorney was gripping his pen with white-knuckled intensity. On the other side of the room, Sterling's legal team remained still, practiced, unreadable. They were used to his antics. They had been paid handsomely to pretend nothing was ever out of place. But even they knew. This was different. Sterling wasn't just another rich man with an expensive lawyer. He was a man who had spent decades bending the world to his will. And now, he was facing Judge Mia Adams, a woman who didn't flinch in the face of power, a woman whose record was impeccable, who didn't care about money, didn't care about influence, didn't care about the games men like Sterling played. She was here to serve the law, and today, the law had come for Richard Sterling. The cameras in the back of the room caught everything. The footage of him sitting, refusing to acknowledge the court's authority, was already being uploaded, already making its way into newsrooms, onto social media, onto television screens. But Sterling? He looked bored, like a man who had already decided the outcome, like a man who knew something no one else did. And then, the charges were read aloud. That's when the energy in the room shifted again, but this time, it was much worse. The prosecutor stood, smoothing out his suit jacket before speaking. His voice was calm, deliberate, but with a weight that made everyone sit up a little straighter. Your Honor, the state presents its case against Richard Sterling, charged with securities fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Even though most people in the courtroom already knew what Sterling was accused of, hearing the charges spoken out loud added something real to the moment, like cement drying on a foundation that had already been laid. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflink, still projecting the same air of indifference he walked in with. But those who had followed his career knew the truth. Richard Sterling had never been in a position he couldn't buy his way out of. Until now. Judge Adams glanced at the prosecutor. Proceed. The attorney nodded and stepped forward. He knew he wasn't just arguing a case. He was going up against one of the most powerful men in the country, a man whose wealth had been built on bending laws until they broke. Over the course of 15 years, Mr. Sterling orchestrated one of the most complex financial fraud schemes in modern history. Through insider trading, market manipulation, and offshore accounts, he stole from investors, laundered money, and bribed government officials to cover it up. There was a shift in the jury box. A few members furrowed their brows. He thought no one would catch him. He thought his power made him untouchable. But today, we present undeniable evidence that Richard Sterling knowingly, willingly, and repeatedly broke the law, destroying thousands of lives in the process. The attorney turned slightly, looking toward the defense table, and today, he will be held accountable. Sterling's lead attorney, a man named Daniel Graves, stood up before the weight of the words could settle too deeply. Your Honor, Graves said smoothly, Mr. Sterling maintains his innocence. The prosecution is painting a picture that simply does not reflect reality. The defense will show that these accusations are built on speculation and assumption rather than facts. Judge Adams nodded once. Noted. Prosecution, continue. The prosecutor walked to the evidence table and picked up a file. He held it for a moment, letting the courtroom settle before he spoke. Mr. Sterling, would you like to address the court? For the first time, Sterling moved. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The smirk was gone, not replaced with fear, but with something else, something colder. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly, then sat back again, looking at the prosecutor like he was a waste of time. No, he said simply. The prosecutor didn't flinch. Very well. But before he could continue, Sterling did something strange, something no one was expecting. He stood up. Not to address the judge, not to speak, but for an entirely different reason. And that's when everything changed. A rustle moved through the courtroom as Richard Sterling rose to his feet. At first, no one reacted. They were still processing it. This was the same man who had arrogantly refused to stand when the judge entered, the same man who had sat through the charges against him like they were a mild inconvenience. And now, without warning, without permission, he was standing? Judge Adams didn't say a word, but her eyes lifted to meet his. The silence stretched, waiting for him to explain himself. But Sterling didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his suit jacket. A collective inhale rippled through the room, hands tensed. The bailiff took a step forward, his stance shifting into something more defensive. One of the jurors flinched. Judge Adams didn't move. Neither did the prosecutor. But the moment held something new now, something tight. Then slowly, Sterling pulled out a piece of paper. Not a weapon, not some bold act of aggression. A single folded document. The room exhaled, but only slightly. Sterling took his time unfolding it, smoothing it out with the tip of his fingers. Then finally, he spoke. Since everyone in this room seems so eager to put me away, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife, I thought it'd be interesting if we took a moment to see the full picture. The prosecutor frowned. Mr. Sterling, this is not your time to speak. Sterling ignored him. For weeks, I've sat back and listened to the media paint me as some kind of villain. And sure, I get it. Billionaire bad guy, easy story. But here's something they don't want you to know. He lifted the paper higher. What if I told you that some of the very people who are trying to put me behind bars are guilty of the same crimes? A ripple of shock moved through the room. Whispers exploded among the reporters. Some scrambled to write. Others checked their cameras to make sure they were capturing everything. Judge Adams finally leaned forward, her voice sharp. Mr. Sterling, if you do not sit down, I will hold you in contempt. Sterling turned to face her fully. With all due respect, Judge, I think you might want to hear this. He placed the document on the defense table. I have evidence, he continued, that several top officials, including some connected to this very case, have been involved in illegal financial dealings, worse than anything you're accusing me of. Gasps. Reporters froze. The prosecutor's face tightened. Even Judge Adams, unshaken through everything so far, studied him now. Sterling had just flipped the entire courtroom on its head. This was no longer just about his guilt. It was now about who else had their hands dirty. And the moment he stood up, everything changed. But the fallout? That was just beginning. For a full 3 seconds, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Then chaos. The reporters erupted into a frenzy, their fingers flying across keyboards, whispers escalating into hushed shouts. The defense attorneys exchanged sharp glances, their carefully crafted poker faces slipping for the first time. And the prosecutor? He didn't move, didn't speak. But his jaw tightened, just enough for those watching closely to notice. Judge Adams tapped her gavel once, a single, firm motion. The noise didn't die completely, but it staggered. Mr. Sterling, she said, calm but unreadable, place that document on the table and take your seat, now. Sterling's lips curled into a half smile. He had everyone exactly where he wanted them. Slowly, he placed the paper down, but instead of sitting, he kept his hands on the edge of the table, leaning forward slightly, owning the room in a way that only a man with nothing left to lose could. See, here's the thing, he continued, his voice smooth. I'm not saying I'm innocent. I'm saying that if I go down... He let his words hang, eyes scanning the room. I won't be going down alone. A new kind of tension wrapped around the courtroom. Not just about him anymore, but about who else was involved. Because now, there were people sitting in that very room, people wearing suits, people holding power, who were suddenly very, very nervous. Judge Adams studied him, unshaken. You're making a serious accusation, Mr. Sterling, she said. Do you have proof? Sterling exhaled slowly, tapping the document with his fingers. More than enough. The prosecutor finally spoke, his voice tight, carefully controlled. Your Honor, this is clearly a last-minute stunt to deflect from the charges against him. Sterling didn't even look at him. Of course you'd say that. The air crackled, but then something unexpected. Judge Adams leaned forward. If what you're saying is true, she said, you'll have an opportunity to present that evidence properly. But let me make something clear, Mr. Sterling. She paused, her voice dropping just slightly. This court is not a stage. If you think you can manipulate these proceedings, you're mistaken. Sterling's smirk faltered, just for a second, because this was a woman he couldn't shake, a woman he couldn't buy. The silence that followed was different, heavier. Everyone knew what was coming next, because Sterling had played his biggest card. And now, Judge Adams was about to make her move. For the first time since the trial began, Richard Sterling didn't look so sure of himself. Judge Adams studied him for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on the bench. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She wasn't rattled. She was calculating. And that, more than anything, made Sterling uneasy. Bailiff, she said finally, collect the document. A uniformed officer stepped forward, taking the paper from the defense table. The entire courtroom held its breath. Would the judge take it seriously? Would she expose the people Sterling claimed were involved? But instead of reading it, she set it aside. Sterling's jaw clenched. You're not going to look at it? Judge Adams met his eyes, unwavering. This is a court of law, Mr. Sterling, not a negotiation table. The weight of those words settled over him, because suddenly, for the first time in his entire life, he had no power here. The courtroom was silent. Mr. Sterling, the judge continued, the evidence against you has been reviewed thoroughly. The state has provided substantial proof of your crimes, fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice, and your sudden attempt to shift blame does not absolve you of your actions. Sterling's throat bobbed. Therefore, this court finds you... She let the pause hang, solidifying the moment. Guilty on all counts. The words hit like a hammer. The entire room erupted. Gasps. Reporters scrambling to be the first to push out breaking news alerts. Spectators whispering in shock, in disbelief, in satisfaction. But Sterling? He just stood there, still gripping the edge of the table, still processing the fact that for the first time in his life, he had lost. Judge Adams wasn't done. You built an empire on manipulation, Mr. Sterling, on lies. You believed your wealth made you untouchable, that justice was just another thing money could buy. But today, you learned that this court does not serve power, it serves the law. Sterling swallowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He looked around as if expecting anyone, to come to his aid. No one did, because he had spent his entire life making enemies. And now, when it mattered most, he was alone. The judge's voice remained steady. Your sentencing will be scheduled for a later date. Until then, you will remain in custody. Bailiff, remove the defendant. The officer stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Sterling's arm, and just like that, Richard Sterling, the billionaire who thought himself untouchable, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The cameras flashed, the world watched, and justice was served. Power, wealth, and influence can bend rules, but they cannot erase the truth. No matter how much money you have, your character is what defines you. Richard Sterling had everything, except integrity. And in the end, that was the one thing money couldn't save him from. If you believe that justice should never bow to power, share this story. Let the world know no one is above the law.